A hotel ballroom doesn't usually go quiet in the middle of a gala, but it did the moment a security supervisor grabbed a decorated colonel by the wrist and announced, loud enough for 300 donors to hear, that she didn't belong in the room she'd been invited to speak in. The Magnolia Grand Hotel in Charleston had hosted its share of black tie evenings, but none quite like the Low Country Veterans Heritage Gala, an annual fundraiser that pulled in admirals, congressmen, and the kind of old money donors who wrote checks with 5 zeros and expected to be thanked personally for it. Crystal's sconces lined the walls. A 12-piece band played something tasteful and forgettable near the dance floor. Waitstaff moved between round tables draped in ivory linen, refilling glasses of Cabernet that cost more per bottle than most people's car payments. At a table near the front, close enough to the podium to be noticed but far enough to seem unassuming, sat Colonel Renata Ashworth Cole. She was 51 years old, with closely cropped, silver-streaked hair, and the kind of posture that came from 3 decades of standing at attention in places most people would never see on a map. She wore a simple black evening gown, no medals, no insignia. She'd left her formal blues in the hotel suite upstairs, planning to change before she gave the keynote address that closed out the evening. Tonight, she was simply a guest, sipping sparkling water, making polite small talk with the people at her table, waiting for her moment. She had earned that moment. 29 years in the United States Army had taken her through 2 combat deployments, a Bronze Star, and eventually command of a logistics brigade that kept entire divisions fed-fueled and armed in conditions most Americans couldn't imagine. She had buried friends. She had briefed generals. She had, 4 months earlier, been confirmed for a promotion to Brigadier General, the first woman in her family's 3 generations of military service to reach that rank. Tonight's gala was supposed to be a quiet, dignified celebration of everything that journey represented. The keynote speech had been her idea, a chance to talk about the soldiers who never got galas thrown in their honor. None of that mattered to Dale Buford. Dale Buford was 44 years old and had been head of security contracting for the Magnolia Grand for 6 years, a job he'd taken after 17 years on the Charleston police force, ended in a quiet, mutually convenient early retirement that everyone in the department understood, but nobody discussed out loud. He still carried himself like a cop, the wide stance, the hand resting near his hip even when there was nothing there to rest on. The way his eyes swept a room not to admire it, but to find the thing in it that didn't belong. And on this particular night, scanning the ballroom from his post near the side entrance, his eyes landed on Renata Ashworth Cole and decided, with the kind of instant, lazy certainty that had defined his entire career, that she didn't belong. It wasn't that she'd done anything. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't wandered anywhere, she shouldn't, hadn't so much as left her seat except to use the restroom once, 20 minutes earlier. But Dale had spent the last hour fielding a vague second-hand complaint from another guest. Something about a piece of jewelry going missing from a coat check. A description that amounted to nothing more than a black woman in dark clothing, tossed off by a flustered socialite who'd misplaced her own earrings in her purse and would realize it an hour later. Dale didn't bother verifying any of it. He didn't pull security footage. He didn't ask the coat check attendant a single follow-up question. He just looked out across the ballroom, saw a black woman sitting quietly near the front in a black dress, and made his decision before his second cup of coffee had finished going cold. He crossed the ballroom floor with the deliberate, heavy-footed walk of a man who wanted to be noticed doing his job. Heads turned as he passed. By the time he reached Renata's table, the band had drifted into a lull between songs, and his voice carried. "Ma'am, I need you to come with me." Renata looked up, set down her glass, and studied him for a moment with the calm, assessing stillness of someone who had spent her career reading hostel rooms in half a second. "I'm sorry. There's been a theft reported tonight. A piece of jewelry. You match the description of the individual involved." Dale's hand drifted toward the radio clipped to his belt, a habit so ingrained he didn't seem to notice he was doing it. "I need you to step away from the table." A ripple of silence spread outward from their table, the way it does in rooms full of people who've trained themselves never to look away from a confrontation in public. Renata kept her voice level. "I haven't left this table in 20 minutes except to use the restroom. I haven't been near the coat check tonight. Who reported this? That's not something I'm obligated to share with you. Then I'd like to speak with the event coordinator, or whoever's running tonight's program, before this goes any further." Dale's jaw tightened. In his mind, this was the part where the conversation was supposed to end. The part where the person in front of him got small, got apologetic, got compliant. Instead, she was matching him calmly, evenly, without a flicker of the fear he'd learned to expect and, if he was honest with himself, had learned to enjoy. It needled something in him. "I don't think you understand the position you're in," he said, leaning in slightly. "I can have you escorted out of this hotel right now, or you can come quietly and we can sort this out somewhere private. Your choice. Sir, you have no legal basis to detain me, and I'd strongly advise you to step back from this table. Don't tell me what I have basis to do." Dale's voice rose, sharp enough now that the band had stopped playing entirely, the bassist setting down his instrument mid-song to watch. "I've been doing this job since before you probably learned how to talk your way out of things. Stand up." He reached down and closed his hand around her wrist. It was a mistake measured in milliseconds. Before his fingers had even fully closed, a voice cut across the ballroom. Not loud in the way a shout is loud, but loud in the way that authority is loud, carrying effortlessly over 300 conversations that had already gone silent in anticipation. "Take your hand off her, now." The man who'd spoken had been standing near the bar, having just stepped away from a cluster of fellow honorees to take a phone call he never ended up making. He was 63, silver-haired, built like a man who still ran 4 miles most mornings out of sheer stubbornness, and he was dressed in the formal blues of a United States Army general, 2 silver stars gleaming on each shoulder, a chest full of ribbons that told the story of a 40-year career. Most people in that room had only read about in history books. Major General Marcus Whitlow had known Renata Ashworth Cole for 11 years. He'd been her division commander during her second deployment, the officer who'd written the recommendation letter that helped push her promotion through the board, and the man who'd personally invited her to give tonight's keynote. He had not yet announced any of that to the room. He didn't need to. The stars on his shoulders did the announcing for him. Dale's hand froze in mid-air, still hovering an inch from Renata's wrist. He turned, already preparing the same posture, the same tone he'd used on her, and the words died somewhere in his throat the second he registered the rank insignia and the sheer, settled certainty in the man's eyes. "Aye, sir, this doesn't concern you. This is a hotel security matter. It became my concern the moment you put your hand on Colonel Ashworth Cole." General Whitlow crossed the floor at an unhurried pace that was somehow more unnerving than if he'd sprinted. He stopped a foot from Dale, close enough that Dale had to tilt his head back slightly to hold eye contact. "You have exactly one chance to explain to me, right now, what probable cause you have to detain a United States Army officer in the middle of her own promotion gala." She matched a description. "Jewelry theft. I was following protocol." "What description?" Dale hesitated, the silence stretching half a second too long. "A woman, dark clothing, that's it?" Whitlow's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It dropped instead, low and precise the way a scalpel is more dangerous than a hammer. "You looked across a room full of 300 people, most of them wearing dark formal wear, and you walked directly to the one black woman seated near the front. Don't insult either of us by pretending that was a coincidence." A man at a nearby table had quietly raised his own recording. Then another. The faint blue glow of screens began rising across the ballroom like a slow tide. "Sir, I have a job to do and—" "Your job," Whitlow interrupted, "was to verify a report before you put hands on a guest at a black tie event honoring the United States military. You didn't do that. What you did instead was decide, the second you saw her face, that she was your suspect. I watched you do it. The entire room watched you do it." Renata had not moved from her chair throughout any of this. She sat with her hands folded on the table, watching Dale with the same unreadable calm she'd worn since the moment he first approached. Not fear, not even particularly anger, just the patient, clinical stillness of someone who had survived far worse than a man with a radio clipped to his belt and a grudge he didn't know he was carrying. "Mr. Buford," she said quietly, and it was the first time she'd used his name, lifted directly off the laminated badge clipped to his chest. "I asked you twice to verify this with the event coordinator. You refused both times. Are you continuing to detain me, or are we done here?" Dale's mouth opened. Nothing useful came out. "I think," General Whitlow said, reaching into his jacket and producing his phone, "we should ask someone with a bit more authority than either of us to sort this out." He scrolled briefly, then lifted the phone to his ear, his eyes never leaving Dale's face. Yes, this is General Marcus Whitlow. I need the hotel's general manager paged to the main ballroom immediately. We have a security situation involving one of your contracted staff and an assault on a federal officer at this evening's Veterans Gala. Tell him to come in person and tell him to hurry. The general manager of the Magnolia Grand, a trim, nervous man named Howard Pierce, arrived within 4 minutes, his bow tie askew, sweat already beading at his hairline before he'd crossed half the ballroom floor. Behind him came Diane Castellano, the hotel's director of guest relations, and 2 more uniformed security staff who had clearly been told only that something had gone catastrophically wrong, not what. General Whitlow, what happened? Pierce stammered, glancing between the general, the colonel still seated calmly at her table, and Dale, who had taken several involuntary steps backward and now stood near the edge of the dance floor, looking like a man watching his own execution scheduled in real time. Your security supervisor, Whitlow said, physically grabbed Colonel Renata Ashworth Cole, the keynote speaker for tonight's event, and a decorated officer with 29 years of distinguished service, based on a second-hand, unverified report that amounted to nothing more than a black woman in dark clothing. He refused to consult event staff. He refused to consider her account. He attempted to forcibly remove her from this gala in front of 300 guests, several of whom recorded the entire incident on their phones. He paused, letting that settle. I'd like to know how your hotel intends to handle that. Pierce turned to Dale, his face draining of color. Is that true? There was a theft report. Was there a theft report involving this woman specifically, or did you simply decide it was her? Diane Castellano cut in, her voice sharp. She'd already pulled the coat check log up on her phone, because the guest who reported the missing earrings did so 40 minutes ago, gave no description matching anyone in this room, and according to this log, found her earrings in her own clutch 11 minutes ago. She never came back to retell you because, and I'm quoting her text to me directly, she felt embarrassed about the whole thing. The ballroom, somehow, got even quieter. You detained a federal officer, Pierce said slowly, the math finally assembling itself behind his eyes, based on a theft report that had already been resolved and retracted before you ever touched her. Dale said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Mr. Pierce, Renata said, finally rising from her chair, smoothing her dress with unhurried hands. I don't intend to make a scene of this beyond what's already happened, but I would like Mr. Buford's employment status addressed before I give my speech tonight, because I am not interested in standing at that podium, while the man who just tried to drag me out of this room by my wrist is still working security in the back of the ballroom. Consider it done. Pierce turned to Dale, and whatever residual deference he'd held for a fellow former cop evaporated entirely. Buford, surrender your radio and your credentials. You're suspended pending termination, effective this second. Diane will walk you out. Dale's hands shook as he unclipped the radio from his belt. The badge came next, his fingers fumbling with the clip for several long, humiliating seconds, while the entire ballroom watched to silence. When Diane finally led him toward the side exit, nobody applauded. Not yet. The room was too stunned for that. But as the door closed behind him, a low murmur of disbelief rolled through the crowd. The particular sound of 300 people realizing they'd just watched something they'd be talking about for years. General Whitlow turned to Renata, his expression softening for the first time since he'd crossed the ballroom. You all right, Colonel? I've had worse Tuesdays, sir. A faint, tired smile crossed her face. But I appreciate the timing. 11 years of friendship. And tonight is the first time I've actually gotten to use the rank for something useful. He gestured toward the podium, where the event coordinator was hovering uncertainly, unsure whether to proceed. You're still giving that speech? I am. Renata straightened her shoulders. Maybe more than I planned to. What the room didn't yet know, what Dale Buford, sitting in his car in the hotel or parking garage with his hands still trembling on the steering wheel, didn't yet know, either, was that this was only the beginning of the unraveling. Diane Castellano didn't simply escort Dale to his car and consider the matter closed. She'd worked events long enough to know that an incident this public, this thoroughly documented by half the room's cell phones, wasn't going to stay contained to one bad night. By the time she returned to her office, she'd already pulled Dale's full contractor file, and what she found made her sit down slowly in her chair and call corporate legal before she called anyone else. Dale Buford's file at the Magnolia Grand was thin on paper, but not on history. 3 prior complaints in 6 years, all from Black and Latino guests, all alleging the same pattern: aggressive, unverified accusations, demands for identification with no clear cause, escalation at the first sign of pushback. None of the complaints had resulted in more than a write-up and a brief unpaid suspension, because none of them had happened in front of a general with 2 stars on his shoulder and 300 witnesses holding phones. His police file, which the hotel's legal department requested the following morning, was worse. 17 years on the Charleston force had produced a personnel record padded with 9 internal complaints for excessive force and improper stops, 4 of which had been substantiated by internal review, and a voluntary separation that, according to the retirement paperwork buried in the file, had been offered to him in lieu of a termination. Hearing the department didn't want dragged through local media, he had spent 6 years at the Magnolia Grand, essentially laundering a career he should never have been allowed to continue. By Monday morning, the video clips, 3 different angles, all uploaded within hours of the gala by guests who'd been recording, had been viewed more than 4 million times. The hotel chain's corporate office issued a statement within 24 hours confirming Dale's termination was permanent and that an external review of the property's entire security contracting firm had been launched. The contracting company itself, facing the kind of reputational damage that loses corporate accounts overnight, severed ties with Dale before the week was out. A clause buried in his contract about conduct unbecoming, doing in writing what 300 witnesses had already done in person. But it was the federal piece that turned a viral embarrassment into something Dale Buford would spend years trying to climb out from under. Because Colonel Renata Ashworth Cole was, at the time of the incident, an active duty federal officer attending an official military-affiliated event in her capacity as a guest of honor. The FBI's Civil Rights Division opened a preliminary inquiry within the week, examining whether Dale's conduct rose to a violation of federal civil rights statutes. Special Agent Priya Lindqvist, a methodical investigator with a reputation for being allergic to sloppy paperwork, spent 3 weeks compiling security footage, witness statements, the coat check log, the original and retracted theft report, and Dale's full employment and disciplinary history into a file that, by the time it landed on a federal prosecutor's desk, left almost nothing open to interpretation. The disciplinary hearing the hotel's contracting firm convened wasn't really a hearing in any meaningful sense. It was a formality conducted because corporate policy required one. Dale sat at a folding table in a conference room that smelled like burnt coffee, his union representative beside him, offering platitudes about context and split-second decisions that grew thinner with every document the firm's compliance officer slid across the table. By the end of it, his termination was finalized, his security license flagged for review by the state board, and his name added to a registry that would make it functionally impossible for him to work private security in the state of South Carolina again. The federal charges came 4 months later. A grand jury, presented with the footage, the records, and Dale's documented history, returned an indictment under federal civil rights statutes for deprivation of rights under color of authority, a charge built specifically for men who use a uniform, a badge, or a laminated hotel credential as a license to terrorize people they've decided don't belong somewhere. The trial took place in late autumn, in a federal courthouse, with none of the warmth of the Magnolia Grand's chandeliers. Dale sat at the defense table, in a suit that had fit him better before 6 months of unemployment and stress had hollowed him out. His wife had moved out 2 months into the proceedings, taking their daughter with her, unwilling to keep explaining to co-workers and neighbors why the local news kept running her husband's name beside the word indicted. Colonel Renata Ashworth Cole testified on the second day, composed and precise, walking the jury through every detail without a trace of theater. She didn't need theater. The facts did the work themselves. She did not look at Dale once during her testimony, not out of avoidance, but because, as she told General Whitlow afterward, he stopped being someone I needed to think about the moment he let go of my wrist. The jury deliberated for under 3 hours. Judge Adrian Castellan, no relation to Diane, a coincidence the courtroom sketch artists found mildly amusing, read the verdict with the flat, unhurried cadence of someone who had delivered hundreds of them and would deliver hundreds more. guilty on all counts. At sentencing 2 months later, she did not mince words. "Mr. Buford," she said, looking down at him over the rim of her glasses, "you did not make a split-second error in judgment. You made a decision, the moment you saw Colonel Ashworth Cole's face, about who she was and what she deserved, and you spent the rest of that evening trying to force reality to match the story you'd already written in your head. That is not policing. That is not security. That is prejudice wearing a uniform, and this court has no patience left for it." She sentenced him to 4 years in federal custody, followed by 3 years of supervised release, and a permanent bar from any form of licensed security or law enforcement work for the remainder of his life. Dale did not look back as the marshals led him out of the courtroom. He had nothing left to look back at. Renata Ashworth Cole was confirmed and pinned as a brigadier general the following spring, in a ceremony at Fort Jackson attended by her 2 grown children, her 91-year-old grandmother, who had picked cotton in this same state as a child and lived to watch her granddaughter become a general in it, and General Marcus Whitlow, who pinned the star onto her left shoulder himself, his hands steady, his eyes not quite as dry as he would have liked anyone to notice. 11 years ago, he told the small crowd gathered afterward, raising a glass of sparkling cider because Renata, ever disciplined, had asked for a dry ceremony. "I wrote a letter recommending this woman for promotion because I believed, then and now, that she possessed more composure under pressure than anyone I had ever served alongside. I did not expect to watch her prove that point in a hotel ballroom in front of 300 strangers, and a man who would have done well to ask a single question before he put his hands where they didn't belong." He looked at Renata, who was laughing despite herself, shaking her head. "But here we are, General." She did give her speech that night at the Magnolia Grand, in the end. Not the one she'd planned, but a better one, delivered 40 minutes later than scheduled, after the room had settled and the chandeliers had stopped trembling with whispered disbelief. She didn't mention Dale Buford by name. She didn't need to. She talked instead about every soldier who came home from war, only to be measured, in the quiet moments of ordinary American life, not by what they'd given, but by what they looked like, standing in a room someone else assumed they didn't belong in. "We don't get to choose," she told the silent ballroom, "which rooms people decide to question us in. We only get to choose how we stand when they do." This is the story of a man who mistook a uniform for permission and a badge for proof, and who learned, 4 years too late, and in a courtroom instead of a ballroom, that real authority has never once needed to raise its voice to be obeyed. If this story moved you, if you've ever watched someone judged before they were ever heard, leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from tonight. Share this with someone who needs the reminder that dignity outlasts every assumption made against it. And subscribe to Voices of Truth, because the next story of quiet power, standing up against careless cruelty, is already waiting for you.